So query.h. So here's a, this is query. Here it is. So let's make a space there to emphasize it. So here I have a template type name call object query select call object. What the heck is going on there? So let's peek at the definition. And what we see going on there is, would you let me pull it down, please? So what we see going on here is I'm taking this call object, I'm constructing an empty key set, and then for each record in the database, I'm applying item.second is the DB element. Remember that a associative container like an unordered map is really a collection of pairs, key pair and value pair. First is the key, the second item is the value, and our value is just the DB element, okay? And so now I'm just applying this call object to each one, and it's going to return a bool that says, I found what I'm looking for or I didn't. If I found what I'm looking for, I'm just going to push item.first, the key, into new keys. So now I don't have to know anything. This knows nothing about payload. But the application designed the payload class, and the application code is going to design that call object. And so this function is a gateway between the application-specific query and the application-specific payload, and all this guy does is cycle them through the database. So I can make queries on that payload without ever cementing any of that application-specific stuff in my class. Now there's another nice way to do it that I haven't tried, but I will try before I post it. And that is, I could derive from query and make an application-specific query that added functions that knew about the payload. And that way, I haven't polluted any of my database stuff, okay? But now I have that application-specific extension, and the nice thing about that, in a sense, I would favor that. Oh, I like this method real well for a bunch of reasons, but deriving from the class means that now I can make query functions that the language is tuned to the payload, okay? So it can say, you know, give me this category, or give me that path, or whatever, okay? So they're both nice schemes, either way. But this is what I've implemented here for the select, and we'll show you. I'll show you where we apply it. You know, what I'm doing is I'm building a functor. I'm building a lambda, okay, that's payload specific. So it's just application to application. So you know, all of this stuff is database stuff. But when we get to the application defines the payload. The repository defines the payload. The repository defines that lambda that does the querying. Okay. And now those lambdas are just stored procedures. Eat your heart out, SQL. We got stored procedures too, and much simpler. Okay. Okay. So now there's another piece of the story. How the heck do you make persist? How do you avoid polluting persist with application-specific stuff? That's a head scratcher. How the heck do you do that? Let's see how you do it. So the place to start looking here is payload. I required payload to implement I required Payload to implement 2 XML element. So on a payload, I call 2 XML element, and I get back a pointer to an XML element. He knows how to create the element. Okay. Our database doesn't, because our database doesn't know any of his details, but he knows how to create it. And now I have another, from XML element, I create a payload. That's all I need. Now I don't have to have any application-specific stuff in my persist. Persist just, when it gets to the payload part, says, give me your element. You go figure out what the element, I don't know your structure, you figure out the element and give it to me. And when I'm unpersisting, I say, I don't know what your, I can figure out what your structure, but I'm not going to do that. Just give me yourself. Create an instance of yourself. And I plug it into my database. So each record, I'm sitting there, give me the payload, stick it in the record, give me the payload, stick it in the record, give me the payload, stick. Piece of cake. How could it be so easy? Yeah. So, again, you could inherit from payload and create an application-specific extension and put those methods there. So this requires that the payload implement these 2 methods. And that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. You want to use my database, you got to follow my rules, okay? But I don't have to know anything about you. That's perfectly okay. But the other alternative is for us to simply derive from payload, persist, and add a payload-specific part to it. We'll just be adding these methods or something like that. So now the payload doesn't have to implement the methods. Our extension to payload would implement those methods. I'm sorry, our extension to persist would implement those methods. Either way is fine. Nothing wrong with it either way. Here, so our normal model is that inheritance is giving us substitutability. That's, I say that, that's my mantra. I say that again and again and again. A graphics object, we can, we have this, I have a pointer to a graphics object, and now I can put in a circle and rectangle, and I can add new elements at any time without affecting anybody. That substitutability is really, I'm not using, this isn't for substitutability at all. It's for extensibility. Another good use of inheritance. And now, I'm not trying to be ignorant. I know that I'm talking to this payload version of, this application-specific version of the extension. That's fine, because I'm in the application. So, either way is just fine. But, so, notice what's happening here. We a little bit of forethought, and we've kept all of the major infrastructure absolutely independent of payload, and we figured out a couple of good strategies for extending it, making it work with those application-specific details, and only the application has to know, and only the application has to use it. My code doesn't have to know anything about it or use it at all. Okay. Yeah?
Why is it in there? 2 XML element, why is it in there?
Beg your pardon?
Why 2 XML element is in there?
So what I'm trying to do is build, I'm trying to persist it to an XML file, and the way I persist it is to build a document, and then just say document save. Let the document create the XML. So what I'm doing is I'm adding the payload part of the document by getting that XML element. Okay?
But still, like, it is not a small function, but still we are using it.
It's a very small function. Pretty small. Okay. I mean, let's go look at it. 1 second, let me finish answering this question. So let's go look at it. So here's to XML element. Okay, so here, make tag element payload, blah, 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 that's the whole function. All I'm doing is saving the value in the categories. Okay, I'm making it into elements. Now I give it the element. He plugs it, so my framework, my persistence framework, plugs it into the rest of his document, and then saves it out to a file. Or I'm just, in my demo, I'm just saving it to a string and reading it back from the string, but works just fine with a file.
But if there are any loops, it won't allow to be inline, right?
I can make something inline even if there are loops. It just won't really inline it, but so inline does two things. Inline is a hint to the compiler to put it inline in the code. But the compiler makes a choice whether they're going to do it or not. And it's not a commandment, it's a hint. But the other thing that inline does is it tells the link map, clear out all duplicate references. Okay? And that's why you're doing inline here. Okay, did I convince you, Rohit? Maybe. I'll post this on Tuesday. You can go take a good look at it. I would suggest that. Okay. So let's go back to our notes. So no payload specific processing, no in either query or persist. I started to write a sentence and then I left off, and so I'll finish that sentence before I post it. I forgot what I was going to say there, but I was going to say something terribly important. Now I forgot. But now an alternate strategy used in inheritance, that what we just talked about. One thing here is I think that this solution strategy is not optimal for deployment. What the heck does that mean? So notice that for each of these projects, I have a folder, and inside that folder is a header file and an implementation file. So that says when I deploy, what I'd really like to do when I deploy this is give you one static library and one header file to use in your application, so that you don't have to put all these parts into your repository. Okay, it'd be really nice if you didn't have to put all those parts in your repository. But now, because the header files are down in these directories, the pound includes say persist persist.h. So even if all I want is the header files, I got to make those directories. Even if there's nothing else but the header files in there, I got to make them. So what would be a good idea is to hoist all of the header files out of those directories, put them up in the project level, change the pound includes, get rid of the directory specific pound includes, and now I can put that in one directory of include files and give you a single include file that includes all those other files directly out of the same directory, and a library file, and bingo, away you go. You're ready to go. All you got to do is create one directory with the header files in it and grab my library. I've been meaning for years to build all of my code repository that way, and it's always been second priority, and I haven't gotten to second priority items in the last 10 years, okay, but that's the right way to do, I think. I don't think I can convince Visual Studio to lay out my project that way. I haven't looked at it hard. Are any of the TAs here? Yeah, so maybe you could peek, one of you guys, peek at Visual Studio a little bit and see, is there a property I can tweak, down in Tools, Properties, or whatever. Is there a setting I can tweak to make it put the files that it creates, not in the project directory, but in the solution directory? then it's eminently deployable. Here, I have to copy all the header files into another directory, tinker with them so that they all include out of that same, the pound includes now are correct. Okay. And I would like to not have to do that editing, because editing is a source of many bugs. Okay. I'd like to just tweak Visual Studio. So see if if you can con Visual Studio into building it the Fawcett way. Okay. There is a deploy option, and I think that's just to deploy a website, I'm afraid. It would be nice if, but you guys can take a look at it, if you would, please. I'm sorry, what did you say?
If we change the property elements of this have a VCP or OG, right, which will have what it includes, path, all those things. If we change there the path to the header.
Yeah, yeah, I could do it, but I have to do all that manually. What I'm saying is I would like to tweak a property in Visual Studio so that when I create a project, it puts stuff where I want it, so I don't have to hoist it. I can definitely do it, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to make a deployable version for you before I post it on Tuesday, but I would like Visual Studio to do that grunt work instead of me doing that grunt work. Okay, absolutely can do it. All I got to do is I have to move the header files, or I could move both the header files and CPP files. No real reason to move the CPPs. I can move all the header files up to the project level. Now I got to change every pound include, and I gotta drop this, remove it, don't delete it, remove it, and then add it back in from the correct directory. And that'll reset the project. Now it'll all work fine, but I think Visual Studio won't help me, and I think I would continue to do it just this way, and just at the end, bite the bullet, copy all the header files into some directory, and question.
The code to persist all the elements except the payload of the DB element is present in persistence.
Yes.
And only the payload specific should be the part of the payload, whatever is application.
Yes. That's the idea.
So we are going to pass a reference of the DB element XML, the smart pointer towards.
That's so the persist is doing the smart, generating that smart pointer. So what my code does, what the application specific what the non-application specific code does is it calls that function. That's why I said, we've now, the payload is responsible for implementing that function, because that is part of my. Now, if I do it with inheritance, I don't even have to do that. So that's an advantage of the inheritance approach. And I probably will implement it both ways before I upload it, and decide for myself which I like better, and I'll mark in the notes whichever one I think, and with my reasons. It might be, it's a toss-up, take your pick, but it might be.
Just for an analogy, your design, is it similar to having an interface in Java, such that the application specific would have to implement that particular method?
Yeah, in fact, I thought about using an interface here, which is just a struct, C++ struct with declarations. And that's probably the right thing. If I stuck with this, that's really the right strategy to do. Make the payload. So now the payload has to implement this interface, and so that's that's the instruction. The compiler will make them conform. Okay, that's the right way to do it. For that, it's a good reason. Yes.
Where should I write the two XML from an XML element if type of the payload is vector or string?
I don't care. I just do whatever. The payload does whatever is necessary to create that element. The payload knows. The payload is application specific. It's implementing that function, so it knows what to write. Okay? And coming back the other way, it knows what to write. It knows how to create that payload element. Okay? So that's the idea. Payload knows. Okay?
But still the condition class, you are specifying the template as payload.
So I did something confusing.
And query class.
Just a minute. I did something confusing. I name my template parameter payload, which I like, I'm going to keep. I name my payload class payload. That's confusing. It doesn't confuse the compiler at all. The compiler sees template type payload, it knows this is a template parameter. But if it sees a function, invocation, it knows that this isn't a template, this is the real argument. And so it always uses the right thing. But it's confusing to a maintenance person, confusing to me 2 weeks from now, and you immediately as soon as I post it. So that's on my agenda to change the payload class to, I'm going to call it app payload. Okay. The real one I'm going to call app payload for application payload. And I think I might have said that somewhere here. I hope I did. I think I did in my to-dos. Okay. So this solution structure isn't optimal, but I'm going to by hand do it, and the TAs are going to instruct me how to get Visual Studio to do it for me if that's possible. Probably is not. Now, another thing I did was I moved all the application-wide definitions into a definitions.h. Because I found myself constantly redefining them in classes. Now, so what you want to do, let's look at definitions.h. There isn't that much, just a little bit, but notice that I've wrapped these definitions in the namespace. Namespaces are extensible, okay? So now, new file, some namespace stuff, new file, some namespace, that all gets added into the namespace. Now, here, so I'm not polluting the global namespace with these names are specific, but now I don't have to put them in DB core public and query public and persist public, okay? Just put them here. Now, here's a case. People keep asking me, what's a package? You say it's a, so here's a case where I would call this a separate package. I wouldn't call it part of the DB core package. I would call it a separate package. You just have a single header file. So to me, there's a DB core package and definitions package, okay? But, you can, that's just my weird definition, okay? It would be reasonable to say that definitions is part of the DB core package, but it isn't because it really applies to persist and query, okay? So, another thing you could do is, and I debated doing it, I decided not to, because I decided it might confuse me six months from now when I looked at it, but I could put it up here in solution items, okay? And then that's saying this is solution specific, it's not project specific, okay? So if I were, an engineering manager and setting up a coding standard, I would say, let's do that. That's a good idea. Let's all get used to that. Okay, but anyway. Test class provides a lot of documentation about how to use the NoSQL database. Let's run it. So now, let's look at test class.cpp. So requirement after requirement, demonstrate creation of database. This shows you how to build a database. Query shows you how to do a query. Persist shows you how to persist. You wrote your documentation when you wrote that test class. Yeah. I'll take 2 for 1 any day of the week. I wrote my documentation, I wrote my tests, same thing. And on top of that, I have this marvelous thing called Executable Documentation. Wow! Buzzword of the day, okay? It's just a test. But It really is executable documentation. So I can look at it and say, yeah, I see how, what does it do? Run it. Oh, I see what it does. Yeah. Cool. Right? Right? Maybe. You're not convinced. This guy gets excited about the strangest things. That's why I like this job. I'm having fun. I do. After a very long life, I've come to understand that you make your own happiness. You do. You make your own joy. You can't depend on somebody else to do that for you. You got to do it for yourself. I mean, you guys help me, So, but, all right. That's the philosophy for the day. So let's go back to notes. Did I cover all the notes? Yeah. So, so I like doing this. So here's this notes, and I put this down, and 6 months later I come back to it, and I look over the notes, and I say, yeah, I remember. Okay, yeah. And I've forgotten some of the details. I've run the test stub. Yeah, okay, I remember how to do that. So really, really, really good. One other thing about the test documentation. So there's still a few things I haven't done. So I say down here, testing requirement 10, use of required packages, not implemented yet. I didn't implement that test. Testing R11, solution structure, not implemented yet. I didn't build a database with the solution structure. Testing R12, use of executive package. So now I let my test case be my reminder of what I haven't done yet. Piece of cake. Nice organized way of planning stuff out and picking them up and putting them down in a very organized way. So, people talk about test first development, which I think is the way they mean it, the way I think they mean it, absolutely absurd. Write tests and now write your code to make the test pass. That's junk philosophy, in my opinion. Okay. Would you ever build this with that strategy? Not a chance. Not a chance. You got to think about it first. Okay. But laying out your tests as you're thinking about it and as you're beginning the implementation, so it's a co-process, that makes all the sense in the world. So co-test, I think, is the right word. Okay. Now, I still think we should do test stubs, because test stub is just a construction test. So there's a fair amount of apparatus here, not huge, but I think, just having a little tiny in each package, that way I can pick up that package. I don't have to give you the whole, but I might have a package that would be useful some other place. And instead of, I don't have to pick up this whole thing, so I have the test stub, I can hand it to you, you can look at the test stub, you can build it, you can see how it runs. So I still think you need a test stub, but now probably it's a lot simpler than your working test. This is just get me going, get it up and running construction test, and now I'll depend on this bigger apparatus, this more finely tuned apparatus, for making sure that everything really is working the way I intend it to. And all the interactions are happening appropriately. And by the way, that would be a good thing to say here. I didn't do it yet, but if I remember to, I will. So in the in this testclass.cpp, it would make a whole lot of sense in each of these to talk about the interactions between components. Okay, just it helps would help you understand this code, and it would help you understand the whole thing. So, okay, I'm almost done. Let's take a look at to-do. So I keep a to-do. So I haven't implemented editing. I left editing because editing is trivial. I can edit. I can meet the edit requirements with exactly what I got now, but I want to make it a little easier to use. Okay, I absolutely can edit it now. I can do everything those requirements demand, but I want a little edit wrapper that just makes it a little easier. Okay, so capability exists, but needs edit wrapper to make it easier to use. Add additional removal of records to editing package. Same thing, capability exists. I can do it right now, but I want to have the editing, and the editing package will be trivial. Just a few little functions. They kind of, I got 2 or 3 operations to do something. It just pulls them together in one function, does those 3 operations. So, this add function in XML document has to do with XML document. We do when we're extracting a text node, if you look at the persist, if you remember how you implemented persist, it's a little complicated. You got to go get that child, bracket 0, select value, and what it really would like to have, what you really should have in the XML document is a little function that does that, and also tests the size to make sure there is an element 0. I don't, because in the context I know it's going to be there. I know the text is there, but in general you might not know. So having that little function would be a good idea. So I just put a note there. The executive package is A, to meet requirements, but B, that's where I'm going to test the deployment. That executive package is, I'm going to start out using all the, and I'm going to end up using the modified headers and a static library and run the exec. Okay, so just my, instead of saying executive, you could say deployment. Okay, so you know, and here's the stuff I pointed out that I haven't done that yet, but I'll do it before I post stuff. Bo Soleil, I see you sitting in the back row. I have yet to look at your problem. It's on my agenda for this weekend. I may be able to, if I have time, it depends on how many people try to talk to me this afternoon. If I have time, I'll look at it this afternoon. So if you want, you could come by around 3 o'clock. Well, I'll come by around 2:30 and see if I've gotten to it. Probably I won't. So, you know, if you're home, don't come in just for that. But I will try to look at it this weekend. Okay, am I done? I think I'm done talking about what I want to talk about. Oh yeah, one last little tiny tweak. So what the heck is this XML help demo doing up here in solution items? So when I started building the persist, there was a lot of good code in that XML demo. That's why I wrote the demo. So what did I do? I added it to the solution item and I cut and pasted out of that, yeah, just to make it available. And you know, I was about to remove it. I don't need it anymore, but I wanted to leave it in there to say, hey, that's not a bad idea. If you're going to borrow code from somebody else, now that lets me pop back and forth between the packages, you know. So it's just a little device that, not bad. Okay, any questions about this before we turn to project 2? Yes, Harika.
Does the payload persist only creates the XML structure for the payload? We have 2 XML and
The
2 XML.
payload just creates an XML element, not the text, for the payload.
How you promise that they occur in sequence? Because we have to keep
How do I promise what?
they occur in sequence. Like
What do you mean current sequence?
DB element
I have no idea what current sequence means.
every DB element have payload, right?
Yep.
It should be like first
Yeah, so as I'm walking down, I'm in this record building the document for this record. So the first to persist, I build a document and then I save it. One quick save. So when I'm building the document, I'm sitting there for each record. So each time around that loop, I tell that payload to give me its element. Come to the next record, that element, give me your payload. Okay? So it's in the right sequence. Make sense? Yeah. Yes. I love it. I'm so excited. Aren't you excited? No.
Professor, can you show that call object, how is it working in the query?
Yeah. So how do I do it? So are we talking about query or persist?
Query.
Query? So let's go to query. First to, so here's where I do it. Yeah, so I'm doing it with a select function, right? So now let's go to my query implementation. Let's go to the, let's just go to the test. I think maybe it's more visible in the test. Let's see if it is. So, metadata queries, compound queries, this is the anding and oring, persistence, payload queries. So here, I am building a database to test. I'm not testing yet. I'm just building a database to test. And so, I put in some categories and a value, and I assign one to myself, and I change it a little bit, and I assign it to Amar. And now, so here, here's string category, third category, select on payload categories for this third category, same category, okay? Now, I wrote a lambda that I'm going to use in that select function, okay? Auto has category equals category by reference, okay? So DB element, payload element, return element.payload has category. So I'm not using any of the other select mechanisms. I'm just going in, my lambda is going in there and grabbing out the information it wants, okay? And so now I just say select of that. And so I'll have a stable of those lambdas, stored procedures that I'll stuff into that select. I could have done everything, all the selects, both payload and everything else the same way. Would have worked just fine. But that would cause the user to have to figure out a bunch of stuff. The way I did it with the conditions, makes it easy to test for a bunch of things at once without a lot of, a cloud of crazy, stuff going on in the Lambda. So I like the way I did it, but you understand that you could have just done the whole thing without select. But that's what's going on. This is how I avoid binding that stuff I want to be reusable to the application-specific detail. Okay? Make sense? That answer your question? Yes?
Does this meet the requirement of at least the knowledge principle? Since you have already let the users to use...
I claim it does. Somebody has to know about payload, right? So now my reusable stuff doesn't have to know anything about payload. It just has selective T. So the application builds this. Not my database code. The application builds this, and the application builds the payload class.
So the application needs to add another layer of add another layer to wrap this lambda function and
I don't think so. It could, but I don't think it needs to. You know, this is pretty obvious. Once you get used to lambdas, it's pretty obvious. Okay, so I don't think so. You could, but I wouldn't. You know, we can have a legitimate difference of design opinion here. It's okay, but I wouldn't. All right. One thing I did want to mention, and that is that if you look through all these classes, let's just take a peek at a few of the classes and see how they were declared. So let's look at persist. So here, notice in persist, I made the copy constructor delete, the assignment operator delete, and since I've done that, it won't generate move constructors, and I've made my persist virtual. Why did I make them delete? Because I'm holding a reference to a database that those references can't be copied. You can't reset a reference. So because I made that choice, I'm saying this class is not copyable. And so I make sure that that fails at compile time, not at runtime, by doing this. Okay. I could have chosen another strategy. I could have made this a pointer, but then I would, and you say, but what do I want to do? Do I really want to copy that database? No, could be huge. Do I really want to share that database? Probably not. Do I want two separate guys manipulate? Probably not. So this is probably the right strategy. Right? I think. And you see the same thing with all these classes. So remember the rule of threes for construction, assignment, and destruction. You got three choices. Let the compiler implement it. If I didn't hold this by reference, I could. If this was just a value, that has correct, so I don't have to implement anything. And that would have been a very reasonable choice. Why didn't I make that choice? If I make that a value, every time I create that instance, I have to copy the whole database. If I got 10,000 items in the database, performance problem, so I made it a reference. So in order to support good performance, I accepted that slightly diminished capability. I can't make copies, and I can't assign. And I don't know any good reason why you'd want to, really, in truth. Okay? So, the same kind of... Now, why was the destructor virtual? Because I may want to inherit from persist. And I have told you, I haven't explained why yet, but I've told you in class several times, for all your bases, make the destructors virtual, and on Tuesday, I'll tell you why. Okay?
Why do we need both line 50 and 52?
Why do I what?
Why do we need line 50 and line 52?
Line 50 and 52, so that I can't... So if I don't have these here, when I go to copy this, this will fail at runtime because it won't allow me to reset that reference. Okay? This makes it fail at compile time, which is when I want it to fail. Okay? All right, and the other, look at the other classes. They're all the same way. They're either don't implement anything because they don't need to, because their bases and members have the correct semantics, or they delete stuff, or they implement it. But I don't think anywhere here I implemented any of those. Okay. I forgot. Also, one other reason, Tharut. This is a very clear message to a maintenance developer. I don't intend this to be copied. Beware, demons lurk there. Okay, maintenance developer. Okay, so. All righty, I think I have said everything there is to say about this. So, Let's kill it. Any last questions before I kill? Well, I'll just put it down so if somebody thinks about a question, we can pull it up. So let's go pull up Project 2. Are there questions about Project 2? One question is, you promised us you would do a demo of a pop-up code display, and I didn't. I didn't get to it yet. It's fairly simple, and it's on my agenda for this weekend. I expect that I will do a code pop-up for you this weekend. So, yeah, you know, there is, if you're interested in pursuing it a little bit before I get around to it, you will find you will find, I think it is in 687 code, spawn proc. Spawn proc. And spawn Win32 proc. I think these are identical, actually. Let me click this. So this so what this does is my main process, which is this console application, spawns this child process, passes some arguments on his command line, which this guy puts out, and then I've opened an anonymous pipe, which you don't have to do, and I'm not going to do in my demo for you. I've opened an anonymous pipe to let this guy talk back to the parent application. Okay? Inter-process communication. So we're going to do very similar things, but we're going to do things that are valid across machines as well. We're going to use the TCP stack to set up communication channels. But you know, if you want to look at it, it's here. But I would suggest you just, you know, you got lots of other things to work on. I would suggest that you don't, just because there's this code, Microsoft, for some strange reason, made it very difficult. The OS has a facility that will tell you the last error your process made. If it's a socket error, it'll tell you. If it's a memory allocation, memory access error or something, it'll tell you last error. But if you make 3 errors, you only see the last one. And for some reason, a very useful thing, they make it really easy to get an error code that means absolutely nothing to you, and they made it very hard to get the string that tells you what happened. Way to go, Microsoft. Cool. You did it again. You did what was easy for you and hard for me, and so you got to write a whole bunch of junk stuff, blah. But this gives you the string, okay? So what you'll probably do, I will put this in what I give to you, you know, whatever I do this weekend. I'm going to make a little process class, and I'll package it up, and I'll put a little note that says, "Demons lurk here, beware," okay, or something. Yes. On the command line, and there's blah, 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 blah. Okay, hang on. So here there's a startup info, and that's how you pass information to the. Okay, it's that structure is how you do it. Now I also have I'm setting up a name pipe here, and I'm not going to do that in the demo. It's just, you know, you don't need it. All you want to do is pop up a code window, you know, that you can scroll around to.
That pop-up window should contain browsing information.
Well, what I'm going to do, we're going to do something simpler. In Project 4, you really got to be able to scroll around it and all that blah, 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 blah. What I'm going to do is simply write it out to the parent console window, or maybe I'll just write it out on the child window. That's what I'll do. I'll write it out on the child, just as a console. I'm just going to make a console that opens a file, that displays the file on this console, you know, that meets the requirement, and we'll do something a little fancier and easier to use when we do Project 4. When we do Project 3, I'll probably move that requirement to Project 3. You got to do a GUI anyway, and so I'll probably move that requirement to pop up a code window into Project 3. So, Naga, send me an email, or no, the TAs are here. So, Pranjal, send me an email that I'm going to move the requirement to do a pop-up code window from Project 4 to Project 3. Okay? All right? Did that answer your question? So we're not going to, it's going to be really simple. The whole idea, let's do it simple, you know, and when we get to Project 3 and Project 4, we'll make it slick. Okay, this is just, you know, concept. Well, you know, we're being agile. This is agile development. We developed some core capability. Actually, the most important, the hardest part is really keeping track of all the data in the repository. We did that already. It's done. Now, the next part is just to get the concept right for the repository. Let's get all the parts so they work, okay, and demonstrate that all the parts work. That's the second, our second, what's the term the Agile guys use? Sprint, our second sprint, okay. Our third sprint will be to build a GUI and a communication channel. And the final guy is to wrap it all together with one big smile and say, yeah, there it is. Okay?
Professor?
Yeah.
Do we need to use spawn from in Project 2?
I will do a demo for you. You have to pop up, you have to show code. There's a requirement to show code. And I will do a demo that really gives you more help than you need. Okay. So, yes.
So we have to make some changes in the current file to make it as a next version to save it in the package. Like if there is a header file, we have to make some changes and keep it as a new version. So how we are going to make the changes in the header file?
So if you're making changes to my code, is that what you're asking? So the question is, I'm going to take some of the code you gave me, and I'm going to change it to satisfy my own design impulses. And so what you do is you make the changes, and where my name was author, you put your name, and you list me as the source.
No, in the project 2, we have to make the new versions for the files.
Oh, you're talking about the versioning requirement. I'm sorry. Yes, okay.
So for that, we have to make changes in the first version and save it as a new version.
Yep.
So we are going to do it using the code, like spawning the process and make the changes? Or
no, So that is really, all of that is something the client will do.
Okay.
And probably the client would do that outside of any of our project code ever in the 4 projects. You know, the client has Visual Studio. We don't want to re-implement half of Visual Studio. Let her use Visual Studio, okay? So, you know, how you do that and where you put it, that's totally up to you, okay? You just have to capture that when you submit it, you know, that's all. Yeah.
Do we have to make use of your project one while developing?
Nope, absolutely not. The reason I'm posting it is there will be a few people who will say, my database wasn't good enough. I'm stuck. I can't do project 2 because my database wasn't good enough. They can use my database. Okay? I would like you to use your own. I would prefer you to use your own. Okay? Maybe as we grade it, I'll be instructed and I'll see some really slick things you did and I'll say, wow, I'm going to steal that. That's a cool idea. Okay. So I do that, you know. I try to give credit when I do it, but I do that, you know.
Why not some bonus? In that circumstances, why not some bonus?
Why not some bonus? Bonuses I don't do very often. They're just too hard for us to manage accurately. You know, it's not. Every time I do a bonus, somebody gets cheated. You know, they actually did it and they don't get credit for it, or they didn't do it and they got credit for it. Just too much for us to. We have too many of you and too few TAs. Right, guys? Yeah. I like the idea of bonuses, other than it's just too hard to work out. Okay, so anyway, this is here. You know, it's going to change a lot. I'm not going to do any name pipes in what I do for you, but there is a, you know, basically here we're setting up parameters for create process, and then we call, you know, I'm getting the startup info, filling up the startup input, and create process. So that's what's doing, you know, that's what's doing that. So. I thought about what I was going to do. You know, am I going to pop up Notepad and fill out? It could, but I decided to just create a little app that would open a file. The issue there is that when you open a file, this is in a repository, then or maybe it's not. Maybe it's in your, you know, in your team's area. But somebody else might already have that file open, and so you need a little retry wrapper. And that, yeah, so I figured I would probably do that. Notepad doesn't have a retry wrapper. So anyway, that's that. So let's go back to project 2. Maybe that's where we were. Yeah, we were on project 2, weren't we? So let's go back to any questions about the requirements or what's expected of you or how we're going to do this? Or yes?
Could you please explain a little bit more about check-in package?
About the testing package?
Check-in.
Check-in package, yeah. So, let's do a scenario. I have a package in the repository that's version 2. And I extract it, and the extraction process will strip off the version number. Has to, or I can't build it. Okay. If I have a project, you know, if I use version numbers, I'm forever got to change the project, you know, so we strip off the version number. And that's fine, no problem. And so I make some changes, and now I want those changes to be in the repository. So if my check-in, when I extracted that package, if that check-in is still open, I will simply examine the file that's there, grab its version number and stick the version number of that open check-in and stick that on my file and copy the new file over the old file, because this is an open check-in. I can make any changes and additions I want. But if the check-in is closed, now what I do is I go and I get that closed check-in version number, I increment it by 1, and I post-pend it to my file name, and I check it in. And it may be an open check-in, may be a closed check-in. It'll probably be an open check-in. I would make open check-in the default, okay? But I think the repository probably should emit a warning if you extract an open check-in. This is still in progress. And I think the repository should refuse to allow you to close your check-in if you have dependencies on any check-in that isn't closed. I think I've required that. Okay? So that's what we do.
So we just copied those files to a new directory?
So, so for project 2, you'll copy them, but what you would like to do, I think the better way is to let the repository copy it in. I don't think a client should be managing anything in the repository. So I think the client says, I want to check in this file at this path, and then the repository goes and copies it in. So the repository it might have a staging area, copies it into staging area, changes the version number, moves it into the repository, and deletes the staging area, or clears the staging area. Probably just clears it. Okay? Something like that. But you know, that's part of the design. You work out the design detail. What you need to do is think through, what's my flow? Really is an important question. What's my flow? How is it, what's the scenario? How is this really going to work? Before you write any code, how is this really going to work? Well, I got to do this, and then I got to do this, and then I got to do this, and oh, but that's going to cause me a problem, so let's rethink it. No, I got to do this, and then this, and this, and this. That's the model, okay? Make sense? What's your name in the back? Yeah.
Fred.
Oh, Fred, yeah. Fred, you're in distributed objects too. Sorry, Fred. So. You aren't any relation to Garfunkel, are you?
No.
You both admired the same presence or same haircut.
Lack of haircut.
Hmm?
Lack of haircut.
Well, oh, it was a studied lack of haircut. Okay. I really like Garfunkel. I think Simon and Garfunkel are one of my all-time favorites. I would play them and play them and play them. Okay. Other questions? Are we done? I can be done. Once we ring the closing bell, I won't answer any more questions. So, can't think of any questions? Yes. Good.
So can you elaborate more about browse package?
So browsing is a process of walking through a dependency chain showing the descriptions, the name and descriptions. So maybe you would display the key, which is really the file name, the name, if it, and the description. In Project 4, the user will click, 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 click to decide where he wants to go. But there's no clicking in Project 2. We don't have a GUI. So you're just going to do a programmed display. And what I think you should do there is pick an element that has children and walk that tree. That's why I gave you, but that's actually a graph, and I owe you, it's actually a graph. You need to do a graph walk as part of that browse. So you need to do a graph walk for browsing, for your display of browsing. You don't need to do a graph walk for browsing in Project 4 because the user's going to do the graph walk. But you need to do a graph walk for your demo for Project 2. And the only difference between the tree walk, which I've shown you, I haven't shown that. Did I run that for you?
No.
Let's take a minute and run tree walk, okay? And I'll tell you what you got to do to it and why you got to do it. So I think I put tree walk in Project 2 help. So SU 687 code Project 2 help Spring 18 tree walk. Now first I will run it and then we'll talk about it. So I built a tree that has a root and two children and child 1 has a grandchild, and that grandchild has a great-grandchild, and child 2 has 2 grandchildren. Okay? And I got this from a left to right depth first search recursively. And then recursive bottom to top depth first search, you know, I just inverted that order. How did I do that? We'll see. Recursive right to left depth first search. So now, instead of going from the left of the tree to the right of the tree, I'm going from the right of the tree to the left of the tree, and sure enough, I go to child 2, then child 1. Okay. And now I'm going to do a stack-based depth first search. I'm going to eliminate the recursion, do it with a stack, done. Stack-based, you know, I didn't illustrate every single case, but most of them. Now I'm going to do a queue-based breadth first search. So I go to root, child 1, child 2, grandchild. So now I'm going to go to this guy's grandchild 1, grandchild 2, 1, and now this guy's grandchild 2, 2, great-grandchild. I don't know why this is named 1, 1. It should have been 2, 1 or something. But. Okay? So how did all that happen? And what do I have to do to make this, turn this into a graph walk? Now, the first thing is I have two projects, node operations and tree walk. I'm not using this. I did this node operation to build a node class to make sure it worked, and now I'm using it here. I'm not really building a tree, I'm just wiring together nodes. Okay? Well, it would be easy to turn it into a tree just to make a vector of all those, you know. But anyway. So let's first go to main. So here's my main, and so I'm just building this tree by wiring together nodes, you know, smart pointer to this root node, you know, blah, 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 blah. I just keep adding children, and I'm just sitting there holding, instead of putting it into a tree structure, I'm just sitting there holding that root node, that's all. Okay, so now, recursive left to right depth first search, I just say depth first search left to right. So this is depth first search, recursive, left to right. Any node, I can start on any node I want. I'm going to start at the root. And now I display the node name. And now for auto, pchild, pnode.children, same thing, depth first search right, recursive left to right, pchild. I'm done. Whole thing. Now the problem here is if I have a loop, if this is a graph and not a tree, I might have a loop. And guess what? I get to spin around that loop, keeping pushing until bam, my stack overflows and my process dies. Big, ugly exception. Blah. Okay. But what I need to do for a graph walk is to mark the nodes. So now my node structure has to have a visited. And it's got to be set to false when I start. And now what I do is every time I visit a node, I mark it as visited. And now when I come to a child, here I'll say, if not visited, okay? That's all you got to do. There's one little quirk. And that is, I would like to unmark everything when I'm done so that I can always immediately, okay. So what I would do is I would write a little wrapper around this that would unmark the nodes and then do the, okay, just to make sure that, you know, everything is unmarked. Recursive left to right, bottom to top. So now all I'm doing here is instead of displaying and then pushing, I am pushing and then displaying. Only difference. Head recursion, tail recursion. That's a computer science term for it. Highly technical. Okay. So, all right. Recursive right to left depth first search. Now, all I got to do that is reverse the order that I'm indexing these. So now I'm just indexing from back to front. Okay? That changes the direction. And stack-based right to left depth first search. So now I'm going to replace recursion with a stack. So what we're doing when we recurse, we're using the stack frame as a stack. We're saving this node, this node, this node as we push down, and when we pop back up, we get back to that old node, pop up, we get to the previous node, pop back up, we get to the previous node. Okay. So now all we're doing is, instead of doing that recursively, so here, stack, here's my node stack, and I push the opening node. While node stack size greater than 0, when that stack is empty, I am done, better be, okay? So now, p current node equal node stack dot top, node stack dot pop, popped it off, and then I print out p current node name for auto p child, p current node, p child, node stack dot push p child. Push onto the stack. When I'm done with that child, pop it off. Next child, push it on the stack. When I'm done with that child, pop. And that child might be going to a grandchild, So that's just stack-based replacement or recursion. Computer Science 101. Right? Yes! I'm not a computer scientist. I teach all computer engineering courses, but I'm an electrical engineer. Okay. You probably heard me say that. All my degrees are EE. I always tell you, students come to me and say, I'm really worried about your course. My background is electronics. Right? Some of you guys have said that, right? I'm really worried about your course. My background is all electronics. And I look at them and I say, with this no smile on my face, all my degrees are EE. We're in this together. Okay? So you can do it. You can. I promise you, you can do it. So let's stop here. But so all we got to do is mark, and now so I take this and I mark it and I relabel it a graph walk. Okay. Okay. Now I think we probably are done. Are we done? Did that evoke some more questions? So in the browse, we're just going to display. We're going to display the kinds of things a user would see if that was a user direct. Okay. So you pick some chain. Was there a question here? No.
It's not related to project, but it's related to debugging.
Okay.
I've asked a lot of people and research, but is there any way in Visual Studio where we can evaluate an expression but not executing that line? Like, for example, inside an if condition, there's an expression.
So you don't want to execute the line, but you want to evaluate the expression.
Yeah.
You certainly can if you execute the line. I don't know the answer to that. Why don't you consult Dr. Google and then tell the rest of us? You tried and you didn't find anything? My guess is probably not. I know that some debuggers will do that. I think GDB does it. I don't like GDB much, but I think GDB does it. So I use G++ some and GDB a little bit, and but. All righty, I think we're done. Are we done? Questions? Questions? Going once? I won't answer any questions after we get to 3 times. Going twice? Okay. Yes.
I didn't understand what you replied before of the last question. So in project 1, so I asked when the payload payload type is vector of strings, you say that
So the payload vector, my payload vector is my payload categories are a vector of strings. So how do I handle that?
in the DB code, if the payload type is vector of
So the DB core doesn't know anything about that. DB core is just saving away a payload. Payload knows that, but it just saves away a payload.
yeah, we are writing the from XML and to XML functions.
Yeah, but it's not the DB core. It's not persist that writes that. It's the payload that writes that, and payload knows. That's the whole idea. Those are functions that we demand, that my persist demands the payload implement.
Okay, so should I specialize that particular function from XML or to XML if the type of the payload is just a vector of strings in DB code? In the DB
Yeah, because the point is that next time it'll be something different.
Yeah.
And if you hardwire it into your database, then it's not reusable. It's welded to that one application. And you got to go with scissors and snip, 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 and cause arterial bleeding and you know, as you're dying from loss of blood, you know, loss of, you know. So you don't want to do that, right? Okay, guys, I think we're done. Let's vamoose.
The clean.bat shouldn't create any problem. I double tested it. The student came to me. Unless they delete manually the folder, your clean.bat doesn't get it.
Okay,
All
good.
you needed was SU.
Yep.
Which, you know, I read about it. It's just the same as battery farm. The general configuration. Project configuration is on the
Okay, great. Do two things for me. One is my clean needs to add star.ipch because that can be big. And I discovered that this morning when I was...
some projects, sometimes Visual Studio loads.
Yeah, remind me to change that, to add that, and I will then post it up. Would you also post what you're just telling me here, just on the, if you haven't already, on
Okay, I'll tell them
PL.
not to delete it and
Yeah.
also to compress it.
Yeah. Just run this.
Is there a chance that we might just sit a little bit?
I want to see if there's another wave. I don't think there will be,
Yeah.
but if there isn't another wave, we can just sit here and talk about it.
Okay.
So I will wait. And
I just want to know what time I have to meet you.
why don't you guys, Harika? So why don't you two guys? Can you come at 1 o'clock?
Yeah.
Okay, just come up at 1 o'clock and we'll sit down and look at your stuff. Okay.
Discussion yesterday, like you told me you have time today afternoon, then we'll talk today. We're discussing the query class.
Yeah. Do you still need to talk to me about it after hearing what went on today?
Yeah, because
Okay.
that was a different kind of implementation, and I was talking
Oh
to you
yeah.
So
Why don't you? I would need to talk to the TAs now. Why don't you come? Can you come about maybe 2 o'clock? Okay. Why don't you do that? And we'll talk then. Good. Yeah.
Thank you.
I went through the stairs and got out where we normally do. Okay, yeah, we'll just go to the office.
Let's see. Can I stop the recording? Yeah.
It's probably gonna be discussed with these whatever it's discussed with Professor, a little thing about the persistence package and the query. I was thinking of a way maybe that instead of having the function like to XML and from XML for the persistence, maybe they can also implement like a generic persistence that doesn't say from XML and to XML, because sometimes they use a database on a string type. The string type doesn't implement any,
Well, I mean, you could do that with
Yeah, so-
using inheritance, the way I talked about. You
Yes.
know, that's but I
So
think.
that's like your file manager in some sense.
Yeah, I think you really. I mean, there has to be a way for the generic persist to get an element that represents that.
Yes.
Okay, has to, or it can't possibly work. And so I think providing that method is a clear, obvious way to do it. I think there's one thing wrong with what I did. I didn't make an interface that demands the payload implement it, and that needs to be done. Okay, that's all. That's what I would do. I would create an interface so that forces the payload user, and you know, in the docs, you must, you know, if you don't, and I would do a little test. You know, well, I would do a dynamic cast, and if he doesn't implement that interface, I would print out a little message exiting because you didn't implement the interface.
Actually, when they asked me about this, I told them to use an interface for it.
Yeah, no, that's the right. That's definitely the right thing to do.
There is another way.
Are you coming for a second wave?
Yeah.
You just came.
Because I'm late for the first one.
Yeah. There may not be much of it, but so who's here for a second wave? Okay, come in. That's okay. Then I'll do a second wave. Okay, come in. We will do one. Okay. So let's talk, I guess.
After this wave?
Yeah, I don't think this will go. This probably won't go right up till noon. So why don't you come by? It's now 10:30. I think we'll probably be done in an hour.
No, we'll be in the office.
Okay, yeah, if you're in the office, then whenever I'm done with this, then we'll do it. Okay?
I have a question about the reference tab inside the class.
Why didn't you ask it when I was asking for, were you here at the first wave?
Yeah.
Why didn't you ask it then?
I
said I won't answer questions. If you want to sit here for the second wave and ask that question first, then after you've asked that question, then, okay. So sit down, sit down, sit down. Okay. So then, but you can get up and leave after you've asked that question, okay? I really want people, when I say, are there any more questions, to ask them, not to let everybody, and then come running up to their desk and ask me, you know.
That is after the discussion.
So, that's okay. Okay, guys, so here comes the second wave. So I'm going to do for you what we did in the first wave. And I'm going to go fairly quickly through this, but, you know, stop me if I'm going too fast. What was your question? So ask your question now.
If you use a reference type in your class, will the code outside the class may change the variable?
It's just a reference. What that class holds is just a reference. So if anybody changes it, it'll see the change. And you want that.
So if the variable outside is released before this object is released, will it be
There's no release. Remember, there is no. So if you're saying, if that guy goes out of scope, yeah. Okay.
So I must.
But what I'm doing is I'm making a reference to the database. If that goes out of scope, query doesn't make any sense. Persist doesn't make any sense because the database is out of scope.
So in other cases, if it is not this.
If you hold a reference to something, then the only time that makes sense is you're guaranteed that that reference is going to exist as long as you need it.
So I must ensure the lifetime of the outside variable is longer than this object.
You must ensure that the lifetime of that is at least as long as this one. Yeah. So good question, and you're absolutely right. But in this case, we know because we're trying to use the database. So if the database becomes invalid, our use is invalid. Okay. So good. Okay. Okay. So. I started the first wave, and I'm going to start the second wave talking about my implementation. And what I did in mine is I've added to my solution build.txt, which describes the build process, which by now actually is a little out of date. I got to fix that. Notes that we're looking at, a to-do list, and this XML help demo. And I'm going to talk about each of these and why they're here. Okay? So The build is obvious. I think, when I put this down for 2 weeks and I come back to it, I've forgotten, which is a library, what do I have to build? So this is just a reminder for me, here's how you build stuff, and it's a help for you. Here's how you, if you have problems building it, here's what you got to do. Now, I also have this notes, and I did this for this help session, but I think it's a good idea to put notes like this. So if I put this away, when we move into later projects, I'll probably put this away, and I'll come back to this summer because I want to use it in another project, and I will have forgotten some of this. This refreshes me immediately. So this first note says, no payload-specific processing in query because I use a template member select. Let's see how that works. So our goal is not to have, even though we're templatized on payload, we don't want any payload-specific stuff in our reusable parts, in query, in persist, in the DB core. We don't want any application-specific stuff there. We want it just to be able to respond to payload. But how could that possibly work for query? And here's how it works. Let's go to query. So here's query.h, and I provided a method, a template method. So this class is templatized on payload, but this member is templatized in addition on call object. And this is a select, just like these select. So here I'm selecting on a condition. Here I'm selecting on this call object. So let's take a look and see what happens. Let's simply sit here and say peek at the definition. So what I'm doing here is I'm passing it a method that returns true or false. That method is going to accept a payload. It's going to accept a DB element, not a payload. It's going to accept a DB element. And its job, what that call object has to do is return true or false depending on whether what I'm looking for is there. Right? So now, in this query, keys equal new keys for auto item in DB. So what item is going to be is a pair. The first element points to the key, the second element points to the value, which is the metadata, it's the DB element which holds metadata and the payload. Okay? So now, if call object item.second, so this says that when I give this callable object a DB element, it's got to tell me if it found what it's looking for in the payload. So the application defined the payload. The application is going to define this method. So it certainly knows how to do that. So my query doesn't have to know anything about that payload. It's just turning this all over to the call object. You figure it out. Okay? So now all it does is it applies it to every element in the database or every element in the key set. Okay? And in the query set, and then if I found it because the call object returned true, then I push that key, the item.first is the key, I push it into the key set, new keys, and now when I'm done, I just make the query's key set equal to new keys. Just what all the other queries do. Query takes an input key set and returns an output key set, but before it returns, it makes its internal key set equal to that result. And so the query just keeps narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. Okay, it's the whole idea. So this allows me to do this without ever putting any application-specific stuff in my query. Let's go look at the test and see how that's actually happening. So here, I'm testing the query, And now what I want to do, and this is just part of my test, okay? And so now what I want to do is I want to test for a category which is in the payload, right? My test is application specific, has to be, okay? So it's not part of the, you know. So now I say, I'm printing out select on payload categories for whatever, you know, in this I happen to pick third category, okay? And so now, here's the lambda. This is what I'm going to pass that select. Has category equals, so I am accepting a reference to this string. And now I say, on that DB element, so I'm this function is accepting a DB element. That's what you saw me, you know, you saw me apply a DB element to this function back there in my selective T. So now I have this element, and now I just say return element.payload has category, bingo. So it returns true or false if it has that category. Okay? So my payload has a function, has category. The person that designed the payload class has implemented this method. So now my database doesn't have to know any of that stuff. My reusable parts, my query mechanism doesn't have to know, DB core doesn't have to know, you know, nobody else has to, you know, none of the reusable parts has to know. It's just this select function is part of my reusable code, but it's accepting an application-specific call object, and it just applies that application-specific call object to each. It just steps through record after record after record, keeping applying it to the DB element. Okay? So my code didn't have to know anything about the structure of the payload. The application that wrote that function does. So great. And you know, if we run it, we look at for that particular test. Let's go look for that particular test. Demonstrating payload queries. So here I have, I just created a database that, you know, that I'm gonna test. And so on the first element I have first category, second category, and in the others I don't have any categories at all. But in the third element I have first category, third category, and I'm searching on third category. So sure enough, select on payload categories for third category, and what did I find? I found that third element, okay, that had those categories, okay, that I'm not displaying the categories here, but it had third category. So it was correct, it worked. Without ever putting any payload specific stuff in my query class. Now there's another way to do it I'll talk about in a minute. So I want to talk a little bit about how I'm doing the persist, and then I'll come back and talk about this other way. So now let's look at the notes. The notes say, no payload-specific processing in persist due to the requirement on payload classes to implement to XML element and from XML element. So now let's look at persist. So here's persist.h. And these are my methods. So here is, so here's my reusable to XML. So you know, I'm applying this to metadata, you know, which I'll always have. But now, when I get to payload, I say payload, give me an XML element that represents you. So item.second is the DB element, dot payload, that's the payload in that DB element, to XML. I'm telling it, you give me your XML. Okay? And I'm going to get that as an element. So now I just plug it into my doc and I'm done. All I had to do. And going back the other way from XML element, I am just creating these elements, So now when I get down to payload, I just say PL, that's my payload object, equals, so up here, when I started here, I said, for each record, I'm just stepping through the records, payload PL. Okay? Just declaring a payload. And now I say, down here, I say PL equals payload dot from XML, p-value dot child. So my payload has to implement from XML. So I don't need to know. I don't know any of those details. Payload does. Okay? So what's happening here is that. So what's happening here is the payload class has to implement to XML and from XML, and let's go look at that class. Let's see what I'm asking it to do. Here's the payload class. And payload implements to XML, and it returns a pointer to an XML element, and it has to implement from XML. It takes an XML element and converts that into a payload. Okay? So the payload class has to implement those. I didn't make an interface that forced the payload developer to implement it, and that was a mistake. I'm going to change that before I post it. I'm going to make this class derived from public iPayload, and iPayload is going to have nothing in it but these two methods. And that'll force it to. Okay? And so now I don't need to do anything. So let's see how payload actually implemented it. Well, here's to XML. So what does it do? It just says make tagged element payload XML processing XML document dot make payload. So I'm creating a little document. Not that I'm going to return a document, just to help me pull things together. And so now XML processing make tagged element value, add it to child, XML processing make tagged elements categories, add it, add child, and now for AutoCat and categories, I'm just building up that XML element, and when I'm done, I don't return the document, I just return this smart pointer to the payload element. Okay? So payload knows how to build it, and now in my persist, I'm just plugging that in. Payload, give me your element, and I plug it into my document, and I'm done. So my persist doesn't have to know anything about XML, anything about that payload. Payload takes care of it. All I require is that you implement those two methods to and from XML. So that's to XML. Here's from XML. Okay. So from XML, I have an XML element. Now I got to create a payload. So what do I do? For auto pchild. So I've created a payload element, and now I'm just grabbing the value and plugging it into payload value, and I grab the categories and I plug that. I'm pushing back into the category children, and I return the payload. Piece of cake. Okay? So I didn't have to know anything. So what I'm doing is I am deferring knowledge of the payload structure to payload. Okay? So for the query, I have this general select, and you just create a lambda that knows how to make that query, and I'll accept it. So let's go back and look at that one more time. So here in query, okay, in your select, oh, I didn't want to go to the definition. In your select peak definition, so in your select, okay, so here's my generic select, and I'm saying, application, give me your call object, and I'm going to apply that call object to every single record in the database, okay, seeing if you're satisfied. So you tell me if you're satisfied, and I'll apply it to every element in the database. I don't have any knowledge of your structure. And in the, again, you know, in the query, I mean, in the persist, so, you know, in the persist, all I'm doing is saying, in my 2XML, okay, I just ask you for your, you tell me, you know, right here, here's where it is. You tell me what your XML element is, and I plug it in into my, you know, I plug it in, and away I go. So I don't have to know anything about your structure. So, done deed. Now there's another way to do this. An alternate strategy is to use inheritance to extend query and persist for application-specific needs, and that would work just fine too. Instead of using this templated member selective T, I can derive from select, I can do a payload-specific select, okay, and now, and my application just uses that, and works fine. I haven't implemented it, but I'll implement it before I post this. So one, and I can do the same thing with I can do that for both persist and for query. So for the way I've implemented for query, I have this template member selective T, and my application provides the callable object here that I apply to every element of the database, and it just adds the key, you know, to the key set if it finds it. So the application tells, and for persist, the persist provides 2XML element and from XML element, and I just plug them in as I do my persist. Okay, to or from, you know, to persist or from persist. So either way works. There is one flaw, again, let me repeat it, one flaw in what I did. I didn't insist that payload implements the payload interface for those methods. I just, you know, but I should make it an interface. So, and now if he starts up and he doesn't implement that interface, I use a dynamic cast and say, oh, you don't implement that interface, goodbye, okay, and refuse to run, forcing him to implement that interface, okay? So you don't have to build any application-specific testing. Bear with me for a minute. My blood sugar is dropping and I gotta correct. Now, one other note I want to make down here at note 6. Test class provides a lot of documentation about how to use this NoSQL database. Let's look at the test class. Testclass.cpp. So let's pick some requirements. So here's a requirement. demonstrate persistence. I haven't implemented sharding yet. It's really simple, and I'll do that before I post it. So here, you can see exactly how to persist. Okay, so I'm making a database to demonstrate persistence. Now I'm just using it, persist XML, blah, 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 blah. So I just illustrate it. So now my test class implements all my documentation. I don't have to implement documentation because my test class does it all. You want to know how to use it? Look at the test class CPP. Okay? And not only that, it's executable documentation. Executable documentation. How does it work? Oh yeah, there it is. That's how it works. So not only do we have documentation in test class, we have an executable document. New buzzword, executable document. Thou shalt. You missed all the stuff about making the database not have to know details about the payload, and I'm not going to repeat them, but I will post it, and there will be a video, so you'll have to go look at the video. I repeated it in wave 1. I said it in wave 2. You came late, so you missed it, so shame on you. But you can look at the video, and you can look at the post when I post. I'll post it on Tuesday. So, yeah, we have executable documentation. New buzzword of the day. If I were an engineering manager, I would say, guys, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to build executable documents. One thing, we test it, and that test is designed in a way to make it documentation and executable documentation. Done deal, piece of cake. Okay, so now, before I address 4, let me make a comment about 5. I moved all my application-wide specific definitions into definitions.h, and there are not many of them. I embedded them in a namespace so these definitions don't just pollute the global namespace, but now I don't have to define them in DB core and define them in persist and define them in query. They're here. All I got to do is pound include definitions. Piece of cake. Good strategy. Now, I started to provide definitions for the persistence, and I took them out. I probably would build a separate definitions just for the persistence, okay? Turns out that in order for this to work, I had to include the XML document because it would know about that. And so I would just move this definitions, and I would put a little note, include after, in the persistence after you've included XML document. Now, this structure is not optimal for deployment. So you're going to build project 2. And if you use my database, you have no obligation to do so. If you use my database, you gotta include all this stuff. Because, so my goal is, I'm going to build a static library And ideally, what you'd want is, for deployment, a single header file that says NoSQLDB and a single library that says NoSQLDB, and that's all you need. But now, because all my header files, let's go look at a header file, typical header file. In NoSQLDB, let's look at persist, for example. Here, persist.h, I got a pound include down in the DB core folder, pound include down in the query folder, pound include down in the datetime folder, pound include. That means that your application, your repository, has to have all those folders because these headers do. So to make this really deployable, I need to build another directory called NoSQLDB and copy all the headers. I don't need the CPPs because I'm going to give a static library. Copy all the headers and change them so that they all just directly, I remove all those relative paths. Okay? Now, when you create your repository project, all you have to do is make one folder, NoSQLDB, and all the header files and the static library go there, and now bingo, away you go. Piece of cake. Now that's a pain. I got to go manually change all those header files. And if somebody reports a bug, I got to go back into my project and fix it, and now I got to take that header, that changed header, and manual, ugh. So I asked one of the TAs, see if you can find a property down in Tools Properties somewhere that tells Visual Studio, don't put the source code down in the project folders, keep it in the project, in the solution folder. That would be ideal. And there may be or may not be. I suspect there isn't such a property, okay, but it would be cool. There's also a deploy button, and I think deploy button only works for websites, I'm afraid. But it would be nice if I click that deploy button and bingo, all it edits all the header files for me. Oh, wouldn't that be nice? Okay. So what I would probably do, I think that this style is nice for development, putting them down in the projects, But I would write a little app. I wrote a Webify app to take my code and put it on websites, write a little deploy app, and the deploy app just creates a folder with the right name, takes all the header files, finds them, changes, edits their pound includes, dumps them in that folder, finds the static library, puts it in that folder, so that app takes care of all of it. I think that's what we're going to have to do. Yes? Buell.
When we do the design, for example, for the payload, I actually try to do it this way. But my doubt was like, whenever you are having a test function, I send the payload as a const payload entity. But like whenever I want to manipulate or simply access it, it doesn't do that much. So I only needed to send just not the constant iterator, but the payload itself.
Well, no, the test has to be application specific. If you're going to test the table, so you could partition the testing too, into just test this core part and now separate out the testing for the payload.
No, it's not like
okay.
Whenever somebody creates a payload, so in select query, you need to send the payload so that they will do their checking of the payload. So whenever I send the payload,
where are you talking about in the test, or are you talking about in the building?
In the payload.
So in the payload, okay.
That means somebody needs to create their own payload to test the system.
So, but I don't expect them to use my payload class other than to look at it and see how I did it. I expect them to. So what I should have done is insist that they implement this interface.
Yeah.
Okay? And then, no, you can do it any way you want. You don't need my stuff. you know, you want to look at it, fine, look at it, but build your own. Okay, that's what I would do. All right? Because really, you know, I don't want my reusable stuff to be in the business of, you know, babysitting. I want to make it easy for them, but I don't want to babysit them and say, oh yeah, you got it, you know, push the T key, push the, you know, I'm not going to babysit them. But, so one last thing, you know, why did I do that? Look it up here in my solution. I have this XML help demo.cpp. Now, you know, if you know, when you wrote it, you used it, right? Well, I used it too. And so I made it easy for myself. I just went to the solution and I said, add XML help demo. And now, you know, I go cut some code out of that, paste it into my class, come back, you know, work on it a little bit, come back, cut some more code out, paste it. So it just makes it easy for me to do that migration of stuff from the demo into my application. So I just think it's a nice little strategy, nice little convenient thing to do to make life a little easier when you take demo code and make it part of your own. Okay? Piece of cake. How can it be so easy? Right? Yes. So I will post this code. So now if you run it, let's run the reusable documentation. When you run it, you see down here at the bottom, not only at the bottom, but okay, testing R10, use of required packages. I didn't implement it yet. I will before I post it on Tuesday. I will this weekend. That's, you know, 20 minutes. Testing R11, solution structure, not implemented yet. I didn't build a database that represents my solution structure. That's for me to do. Requirement 12, use of executive package, not implemented yet. I'm going to make my executive package the core of deployment. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I might build into my executive the editing of the header files, okay, and you know, I probably will do that. Okay, so that becomes, but the point is that what I'm doing here is I am using this test class not only to test, but also to document, and also to remind myself, keep myself in, you know, I haven't done this yet. Oh yeah, I didn't do that yet. Let's go do that. You know, maybe I need a mode that hides all the other stuff and just shows what I haven't done yet. Okay, but anyway. So there is a mantra in the Agile community. So a lot of what we're doing, a lot of what I'm suggesting really is Agile. So Project 1 is our first sprint that builds this core database functionality. Project 2 is a second sprint that now lays out the repository and just figures out how, you know, how am I going to do the check in, check out, and blah, 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 blah. But I'm not really building a full up repository. I'm just have a test bed to figure out how to do all that stuff. Okay, that's sprint 2. Sprint 3, we're going to build a communication channel and a GUI so that we can interact with this client-server mode remotely, you know, and now it isn't just all pre-programmed. Now a user can really do useful stuff. That's the final release to the customer. So 4 sprints, okay? DB core, repository testbed, channel and GUI, final product, bang. Now, in that Agile movement is this mantra, test first. Write your test and then write your code to make the test pass, and I think that's garbage. Garbage, as the French would say. Okay. Anybody here speak French? I would love to know how to say garbage in French. What's your native tongue, Yul?
Mine? Amharic.
Okay. So how would you say garbage in that native tongue?
Garbage. We call it koshasha. Koshasha.
Kotata. Kotata.
No.
No?
No.
So my old ears, let me get closer. So how would you say garbage in your language?
Koshasha.